Hi everyone, we are very excited to show you that we are going to develop in the next few lessons. So in this app you will be learning about how to break a large screen into smaller UI parts. You call it as multi-pane layouts. You'll be learning about creating fragments, adding a fragment to activity using XML. Then you'll be learning fragment event handling, adding a fragment to activity at runtime, and replacing one fragment with the other. So when you run, you will see it's one app you are developing, but when it runs on a smaller device with a smaller screen, it loads only one fragment first. Then you have to click the button to load the other one because it's a smaller screen. But the same app, when you run on a larger device, you will learn how you can display multi-pane so that you don't have to click the button like you click on the a smaller device. Here it just displays both of them at once. So it's very important for you to know how to do this using just one code base and how to develop apps so that it can utilize multi-panes on let's say larger screens. But it's very important that you look at till the end of the lesson and then the next couple of lectures in this series until we complete this app, right? We are very excited to show you how to develop this app. Okay, let's do it now. Hi everyone, welcome to the lesson Android Fragments Part 1 Introduction. We'll be using these tools and these references for this lecture. You need to make sure that you have covered this prerequisite before you start with this lesson, which is Activities Part 9 in this lecture series. In this session, you will be learning about fragments and the design philosophy behind fragments. Android introduced fragments to support dynamic and flexible UI designs on large screens such as tablets. So we'll be talking about that. Then when it comes to creating a fragment, you must create a subclass of fragment. The fragment class has code looks a lot like an activity in Android. Then the fragments contain callback methods similar to an activity such as on create, on start. If you are converting existing Android application to use fragments, you simply move the code from activities callback methods into the respective callback methods of the fragment. So it's a smooth transition. You'll be learning about those in this lecture. And when it comes to creating a fragment, usually you implement at least the following lifecycle methods: on create view, and on pause. We'll be talking about that. Also, there are a few subclasses that you might want to extend instead of the fragment class, such as dialog fragment, list fragment, etc. So when it comes to creating a fragment, then it's important for you to know about adding a user interface. So a fragment usually use as part of activities user interface and contributes. It's usually a part of the activities user interface. We'll see about that. Then to provide a layout for a fragment, you must implement on create view callback method. So usually in activity you override on create method, but for a fragment usually it's on create view where you design the user interface, where you render it. Okay, and then adding we'll be talking about adding a fragment into activity, because when you run fragments you usually you run them inside activity. So there are two ways. We'll be talking about those two ways, and then we'll be talking about this stuff listed here. So as usual we are trying to do it as a practical discussion, right? Okay, let's see about it now. So let's refer the developer docs. So a fragment represents a behavior or portion of user interface. So it's a fragment is representing a behavior or portion of a user interface. So it helps more modular design. So then you can combine multiple fragments in a single activity. So far in this lecture series you have learned about activities. So the idea is when you look at one screen, it's one activity. So if there are two screens, it's two activities. But when you learn fragments, basically inside one screen you can have multiple fragments. In other words, inside one screen, if you got one activity, you can further modularize that activity into smaller parts. we call those smaller parts as fragments. So you can combine multiple fragments into a single activity, and then you can display that single activity on one screen. So that helps you to build multi-pane user interfaces and reuse a fragment in multiple activities. So you can reuse it in multiple activities. So once again, fragments are helping to modularize your activities into, to break them into smaller parts, and then you can reuse the fragments in multiple activities. You can think of a fragment as a modular section of activity. Fragments has its own life cycle, and it receives its input events, etc. You can add and remove them while the activity is running. So you can dynamically add and remove these fragments, smaller parts. Then there will be a question for you asking, why do we really need fragments? Okay, now you understand it helps to modularize the activities, but what's the real practical use? That we will see in a little while. A fragment must always be hosted in an activity, right? So you have to always run it inside a activity, right, etc. Okay, let's look into the important parts. So when you add a fragment as part of your activities layout, it lives in a view group. So basically a view group means container type objects. So if you get a button or text box is a view, but container type objects are view groups. So fragment usually when you add it lives inside a view group. Okay, and then you can insert a fragment into the activity layout by declaring the fragment element. So if you declare a XML element fragment, then you can put the fragment into the activity. So this document describes how to build your application to use fragments, including how fragments can maintain their state, and when added to the activities backstack, you can add fragments to the activities backstack, share events, etc. We'll see how it is. So the design philosophy. So Android introduced fragments from in API 3.0, Android 3.0, API 11.11. It's mainly to support more dynamic, flexible UI designs on large screens such as tablets. So the main original purpose is to support large screens, because when you have a larger screen you have more screen space, so that you can break this, logically you can break the screen into smaller parts, where meaning smaller fragments, because a tablet screen is much larger than a handset, than a phone. Handset means a phone, for example. There's more room to combine and interchange components. So you can combine things. So if you want to combine things into one big screen, that means basically how you do it is you combine smaller fragments. And if it's a smaller screen, you can display only one fragment. Let us say if it's a mobile phone, you can display only one fragment. But in the same app, if the user runs that app on a tablet, because it has a larger screen, then in one screen you can display multiple fragments. So by dividing the layout of activity into fragments, you become able to modify appearance at runtime. So you can modify the appearance at runtime using fragments. So as an example, let's say if there's a news application, right? Let's say like this. If you look here, now if this is one app, let's say if it's a news application, when it's running on a tablet, on a landscape orientation, you can look at my mouse. So here you can display the news items, and when you click on an item, you can show the news item in detail in the right hand side. But the same app, when you are running it in a mobile phone, you can't do it because it's smaller screen. So then what you can do is you can display only the list of news items, and when you click on it, you can display the detailed news on another activity. So here the difference is the same app, when you run on the tablet, it's one activity, and inside one activity you display two fragments. Let's say this listing the news is one fragment, and detailed news item is going to be another fragment. Then you can reuse these fragments when the user runs it in a smaller device. You display that one fragment on an activity, and when you click on it, you display the next fragment. Let's say if this is fragment A and fragment B, here you display both fragment A and B here. when you run the same app on a smaller device, you just show only fragment A on one activity, and when you click, you just load another activity and display fragment B. So this is what we call as modularizing, right? So when that means the advantage is you got two fragments A and B. Sometimes you can display both of them at once on the same screen, or sometimes only one at a time. So this is what we call as modularizing, and this is what we said little while ago, that fragments were introduced to support larger screens. So something really interesting for you. So to create a fragment, you will have to subclass from fragment, right? Then it has code similar to activity, right? It has callback methods on create, on start, etc. Usually you implement at least the following three: on create view, and on pause, right? And this is the fragment life cycle as you see over here. Okay, and also so as I said here, you can implement a fragment by subclassing the fragment. Also you got uh, some other subclasses of fragment. Instead of using fragment, you can sometimes, depending on the situation, subclass dialog fragment, list fragment, etc. Okay, now you got a basic idea about fragments. Now let's talk about adding a user interface. So how do you add a user interface to the fragment? So the user interface to the fragment will be implemented inside on create view callback method. If you remember, when it comes to activities, we implemented the user interface in the activity inside its on create method. So if you got activity, you render the user interface, or you refer to the XML file from the on create method. But on a fragment, you do it in on create view. So you have to remember these things. So to return a layout, you inflate, right? So we will see how you do it, right? Using layout inflator, right? We'll talk about that. So if you look here, the code. So if you got a, if you create a fragment, you extend from fragment, then you override the on create view. These are standard parameters, and using the inflator parameter, you inflate and you render the layout over here. So inside on create view, we'll see how we do it in a little while. Right. Then once you create a fragment, next thing is you need to add the fragment to the activity. So after you create the fragment, now you have to add it to a activity. So there are two ways of doing it. One is you can declare the fragment inside the activities layout file. Now you know every activity has a XML file. So inside the activities XML file, if you want, you can declare the fragments like this. So if this is the activities XML file, then you can, let's say in this example there's a linear layout. So a linear layout is a layout where the items will be added either in the horizontal direction or in the vertical direction. So you give it using the orientation. So horizontal meaning one after the other. So in this example, you got a, if this is your activities layout XML file, in this example you got a linear layout and it's horizontal. So inside that, it has declared two fragments. So then you in this example, it's running two fragments in one screen. So that means one screen of the activity now is broken into two smaller parts, meaning you got two fragments. That is what we were talking earlier. The second option of adding a fragment to activities to do it programmatically. So first option was to do it hard code, static in the XML. Other option is programmatically. So instead of you declaring it in the XML file, you can programmatically at runtime add a fragment into a activity. For that, you will use classes like fragment manager and fragment transaction. You will say begin transaction. This is standard code. And once you begin the transaction, you create your fragment object, and to the fragment transaction you will add it, the fragment object, and then you have to give the placeholder. The placeholder, we will talk about it, that is declared in the parent activity XML file. We'll talk about it. and then you say commit. So this is how you dynamically add a fragment. So we'll be doing the practical for this in the next lesson. So in this lesson we are talking the overall overview. So before we do the practical, we want you to get a clear idea. So now you got some decent idea about it. So then you can manage the fragments using fragment manager, etc., right? And you then, as we said little while ago, you can perform the fragment transactions, right? So there we'll be talking various things. You will begin a transaction, etc., over here, and then at runtime you can replace fragments. If there's one already there, if user clicks on something, you can replace, and then once you replace, it will load that fragment, but at the same time you can add to the back stack. So even after replacing, the user can click the back button and then go to the previous screen. So replace whatever it is in the container with this fragment and add the transaction to the back stack. So you can always go back and see the previous screen. Okay, so it's explaining, right? So by calling add to back stack, that means, right, the replace transaction is saved in the back stack, so the user can reverse and bring back the previous fragment by pressing the back button. So you can always go to the previous fragment by clicking the back button. So if you click a button and go to another fragment, you can go back to the previous fragment likewise. So the commit, you saw in that there's finally commit. So calling commit does not perform the transactions immediately. Rather, it schedules it to run on the UI thread, right? So those are some technical stuff. Okay, then you can communicate with the activity. So the fragment can communicate with the activity when you program it. So from inside the fragment, you can refer to the activity by calling get activity, and then you can call any method on activity while being inside the fragment, such as, let's say, from the fragment, if you want to access the activities items, you can say get activity and then call find view by id and access some item likewise. Also, your activity can call methods in the fragment. Likewise, your activity can call methods in the fragment by acquiring a reference to the fragment from the fragment manager using find fragment id, right? So over here, get support fragment manager, you are using these factory methods, and then find fragment. So this is, you can refer to a fragment from inside a activity. So this is how you refer to a fragment dynamically from inside a activity. And then you can create callbacks to the activity, right? So let's say this example, right? So this just to say that you can implement callback methods inside activity inside a fragment. Then you can add items to the app bar. The fragment can contribute to the menu. We'll be talking more detail about options menus in future. And then handling the fragment life cycle. So you know that as you saw, the fragment got a life cycle. So you can handle the fragment life cycle using various callback methods. You can coordinating with the activity lifecycle. So you can coordinate with the fragments activity. So the fragment is inside activity, then you can coordinate with the activity life cycle by using these callback methods. And then there's an example. This example is a little bit complex for you to do at this moment, right? So what we'll be doing is, okay, so the example, we'll be going to the next section. Look at my mouse, creating a fragment that which is simple. So before I do this example, I will be clicking the next section from here, and I will be doing this, and then I will be doing a flexible UI, right? And then I will come back to the overview, and then I will do this complex example. So once I do all three of them, you will have a clear idea about how to program fragments. It is very important to know this lesson because in Android, when you create your apps, the idea is you need to create them in a modular manner. So that means you will be using a lot of fragments. And as I said little while ago, the fragments are running inside the activities. So far you know to deal with activities, but when you finish this lesson about fragments, you will know about how to modularize and create a flexible Android app. So because of that, make sure to look at the next few lessons after this lesson to for you to see how to do this practically, because we'll be showing you simple apps. We'll develop simple apps after this lecture to show you how to do it practically. Awesome. So we discuss the lesson practically, and the practical demonstrations will be done immediately after this lecture. So the conclusion is you learn what are fragments, you learn the design philosophy behind fragments. So now you understand that fragments are mainly used to support larger screens. So now you know that there's a way of creating fragments. You have to subclass from fragment. It has its activity callback of the fragment lifecycle. It has its callback methods. Likewise, so you have to at least override these three methods: on create view, and on pause on a fragment. Also, you might use sometimes fragments such as list fragments. Likewise, then when it comes to adding the user interface, you realize you have to override on create view, and then you will be rendering the XML file. And then you learn about adding a fragment, because after you create a fragment, you have to add the fragment to the activity. So there are two ways you learn. You can put it into the layout file, activities layout file, or you can programmatically add them. And then you briefly had a look at this part. So we use developer docs and API, mainly the developer docs for this. So look at the next part to complete this topic, because we'll be doing the practicals for fragments, and make sure to have a look at the other videos as well. So we are very excited to see you in the next lecture, next lesson, for us to do the practical of this part. So we'll see you in the next lesson.